Thank you, Michael. That's a very interesting view of your take on the design world. We'll come back to you with questions on that in a moment. So next up is Simon. Simon, ready to launch when you are.
Hey. Basically, my take is more, of course, my own, what can you say, experience and inspiration on how we try to build design that is made to last. And when we talk about building design that is built to last, for me, it's of course more than just having a strong chair or what can you say, something that is built to last in that sense, but it's also how can you kind of emphasize ways to make this product last for many years, in the sense of how you actually want the product to be able to survive for generations. And in that way, we try to work with different things in order to kind of give it something that is unique in that sense. And I think one of the important things for the design that we do is that it's relevant to the context of time. And that, of course, can be done through production or new technique, innovation. It can be done in many ways, but I think often we try to study how is the world changing and try to put these different needs and demands into the products. And it might not be something that is obvious in that sense, but I think it's something when you get to know the product, you will understand where we're trying to go with this product. The first one I kind of think of is our LA series, which is, it is basically just a chair, and there's many chairs in the world, but we try to see how can we make this chair different in the sense of how do people actually, you know, how do they use a chair nowadays compared to previous time? And of course, there's more and more demand for chairs that can do both retail and contract. So of course, making a very strong chair is of course important, but there's also a higher demand for making something that is more customized, so you can change the chair into different expressions without needing to produce a whole new chair. And that's why it's split into these elements, so you can basically put it together in different ways, which will be visible in a moment. And the other thing is, of course, how do you minimize the material so you use less material? In this way, it's been done with gas, so there's minimal amount of pulley to create the chair. And all the leftover of the material is then being used to create other chairs, so there's basically no waste in this production. And another thing is, of course, as most people know, the retail market is moving more and more online, and that's also why this chair has been made into components, so you can basically choose to have it assembled or flat pack, meaning that it is a lot easier to ship worldwide. And just a quick video to kind of show the idea and what was kind of the story behind the chair. And here you see the different components. Of course, this is more a sexy video showing how it's being assembled and so on. But basically what I think is nice about this design is that it's able to kind of adjust what demand that you have for this chair. So whether if it's indoor or outdoor, you can basically put the parts together and create different expressions. And this is, of course, how we try to put these elements into one piece. And that's also why we don't really, I don't really think about trends or other things that could necessarily impact. You can, of course, not avoid being inspired by your surroundings. But for example, this chair was designed 7 years ago. And if the whole point was to make it trendy, then it would be difficult because it took around 4 years to develop it and then a longer process of engineering it. So I think it's important not to focus too much on trends, but rather how you kind of see the future for products in general. And then, of course, like you see in this picture, it can basically be constructed in many different ways. I think the nice thing about, of course, a flat pack, there's nothing new about knockdown constructions at all. But the good thing here is that it doesn't really look like the standard flat pack chair. And also it means that, of course, you can ship 6 chairs flat pack compared to 1 chair sampled. And I think for sure this is something that makes more sense in these current times. Another thing I think is super important for making a product that is built to last is emotions and production. And when I'm talking about emotions, it's how you can kind of, everybody, you know, we all put emotions into certain objects. I'm very fond of small figurines myself for some reason. And there's a reason for that, because they tell some sort of story. So how can you kind of build a story in a product without necessarily making it look like a figurine? But of course you can do that through, again, technology, story, different things. It can also just be the material itself. In this case, I think the bit stool, which is also a series of different products, is a good example of how we use the material to tell the story, and then make the shapes super simple so everyone can kind of recognize them in that sense. What is different about BitStool is the way that it's produced. It's basically pure waste material, so post-consumer waste and industrial post-waste, meaning that all the garbage that is being thrown out, most of it is, of course, disposable plastic, so single-use plastic, has then been shredded into small flakes and then only heated up enough to change the shape of the plastic, but without kind of changing the quality of the plastic. And that basically means that you can recycle the material endlessly without destroying the quality of the material itself. And this is, of course, a mixture, of course, again, of context of time, more thoughts about how can we take some material that is normally seen as something you would not put into furniture and then use it for furniture. And basically there's nothing new about this material. It has existed for 20 years. Nobody just didn't really want to buy it because they saw it as garbage. But nowadays you can kind of see the mentality is changing. We're not striving towards this perfect mass-produced product. People can accept that parts and products are different. And I think that's a really nice, what can you say, new era of products that we will see, where we use all the materials available and not only wood and aluminum and these basic materials seen around. And also making it possible for everyone to actually buy it, so it's not something that is necessarily high-end. I think that's very important, that design should be for everyone and not only the elite. And then just a quick show of the texture and the color, so you can kind of see how it actually works on these stools. And again, it's not really about just creating a stool or extra seating. It's more seen as an object to kind of a statement, an emotion, rather than just being a stool or extra table. It's something that adds color and also adds like this topic where you are asking questions, what is this material and so on. So I think it's a very nice piece that can kind of, you know, if it was just all black, it wouldn't really have any emotions and any story to tell. So I think it's really here about the material more than the shape itself.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you both for that, that introduction, because I think it puts today's subject squarely in context, in the context of your work and your experience. If I can just kick off with a couple of questions, one to each of you. I'll start with Michael, if I may. Michael, you've had a very long and rich experience in developing your practice in Asia, and indeed beyond, for that matter. And you've witnessed the emergence and evolution of design disciplines here, right here in Hong Kong, into the mainstream, from something that was a bit marginal 30 years ago, perhaps. And each step along the way has been paved with difficulties, I'm sure. We've all had our struggles setting up our businesses. So how has the rapid emergence of sustainability, of ESG requirements influenced or changed your own practice of design? I know that you've worked very hard to kind of bring things back down to the local. And basically, how has that affected you, both in terms of the traditions of design, where we come from decades ago, and those kind of traditions that we all share, actually, in the design community around the world, and the relationship with clients, producers, and users. In short, just how do we design for change?
For me, I'd say it goes back more than 30 years, because whilst I never knew what sustainability was, just to sort of ring fence it, you know, I was a big fan of Kurt Schwitters, the artist, who was using rubbish to put on walls, okay? And then I got a job with Tom Dixon back 35 years ago, and we were fundamentally scavenging the streets of London to build furniture. It wasn't sustainable, it was survival. It was, you know, finding things and getting pots and pans and, you know, building chairs. And that was the kind of really early stage of design sustainability. And then, you know, all of a sudden you had Droog Design. And Droog Design were recycling projects. You had, you know, some incredible Jane Atfield started one of the first sustainable companies up 30 years ago, Made of Waste, and I'm a big fan of hers. And so she was already recycling materials. So it's always been something that's been on my subconscious, but never something that I have been aware that I've been part of. But I have been in the process of coming from the bottom to where I am now. And during the entire time that I've been in the design business, I think predominantly over the last 15 years in Asia, you know, the government has enforced certain regulations within China for the production of aluminium, anodizing, chemicals going into various places. So it's not something that I'm actually in control of, and I do profess not to be an expert on sustainability, but somebody who is industrially performing within the parameters of legislation and the factories. And a lot of the factories that have done the production that I work with for the last 10 years have had to invest, you know, $30 million in building new equipment to actually, you know, a lot of people have gone bankrupt because they can't afford it. So it's actually been very hard. So for me to keep my supply chain going, to offer products to people that consume, hopefully for the right reasons, has been complex. And I've had to follow those. You know, now with plastics, we only use plastic with 30% straw in it for our production. And I've just had to follow this, you know, and I have to learn at the same time that the rest of the world is. I'm not somebody who you can come to and say, tell us how to be sustainable. I'm someone who learns and goes with the flow and tries to support the whole ecosystem to keep those guys in the factories eating,
right,
along with myself.
And a lot, if I understand correctly, a lot of what you're doing now is actually looking at trying to help local factories, I don't mean specifically local Hong Kong, but local to their areas, survive in this rather more complicated world that we're living in.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's sort of predominated the last couple of years and is, you know, I used to fly around the world. I was in Milan, I was in New York, LA, thinking, whoa, you know, I'm doing it, I've made it, it's great. You know, meeting someone for a glass of champagne, all the thing, oh God, bang, gone. So I think what I understood is that, you know, that carbon footprint had to be demolished. And, you know, so I set up my own company, my own brand, to manufacture products in China to reduce the carbon footprint and start to work locally, which I think a lot of countries have had to deal with that situation as well. And I've noticed in Australia, there are some incredible designers now just starting their own brands, and I'm like, great, Australia, well done, finally. And so what we're doing now is, we're producing in China and working internally to, optimize our ability to keep prices low, keep the economy going, and design starts to play an important part of that when you get back to the factory.
Right. And by the same token, you're actually reducing your own contribution to carbon production.
Well, yes.
Cutting out the flying hours.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I'm sure one day, once we find a new way to travel, it's going to pick up again. But tonight, you miss your friends.
Right.
But right now, right here, I'm launching my own brand in Hong Kong purely to seek out from the world, because I thought maybe I've got to do it in Milan or Copenhagen or somewhere else. But I've got to look after my own turf and the people that surround me and my community and the creative community, the economic community. So, I suddenly decided, instead of launching outside of Hong Kong, I'll do it here and just start again, find a new way to, to breathe after COVID hit in.
Right. No, that's okay. So if I can turn to you, Simon. You're based in Europe. Far, far away from us. And as we've seen from your work, you're very involved, actually, as you've just demonstrated, in designing for a kind of circular economy. The use and reuse, in fact, multiple use of materials over a much longer period of time. But in a kind of an international context, there seems to be a compliance question that needs to be addressed, particularly in the absence at the moment of specific regulations. I mean, for example, we talk about having to design to specific norms or standards around the world. With the issue of sustainability, of ESG, this is a really complicated era that we're stepping into, because we're not quite sure how to measure what and where the pressure comes from on us as designers or as manufacturers to essentially lead the way where there isn't a very specific direction at the moment. How do you see this absence of standards, and where do you take your lead from in your work to push things forward? Where does the pressure come from?
Yeah. Well, I think what you say, for me, the biggest pressure will be to kind of predict how will the future be, because in many ways you are, if you're going to do some design, like I've tried to explain with the chair also before, you need to kind of predict how will things be in 5, 10 years or whatever, because some things takes a very long time to develop. And in this case, you can start to see a tendency where people are demanding more sustainable products. And if the consumer is demanding it, and the manufacturers start producing, and you can get, the suppliers and the factories to make more sustainable ways of producing products, then for sure it's a win-win. I think regulations worldwide will never be possible, because you can see there's still inches and centimeters, the metric system and all these things, they will never have a common way of figuring out things. Fire regulations are different from each country, so you can never do necessarily the same foam on an upholstery chair that you can do in Denmark. You cannot do the same in UK. So the regulations will always be different because they're political. But what you can do is kind of look into how, making people are getting aware that they want products that are not, damaging the earth in the long term. And of course, one thing is, again, to make products that has a super long lifetime, not only in the sense that they can last for many years, that people also want them around for many years. I think that's super important. Many designs from the 50s are still relevant. People still have them around. And I think that's a very good example of design that is built to last. They were built to last both in structure but also in design. So I think that's for sure the way.
Right. It's a very interesting point that you raised in there, and that is the influence of the consumer in putting pressure onto us as designers and as manufacturers to perform even in the absence of standards.
But it will be I know, many architects that needs to do the interior of a new building. One of the parameters they will have is how can we make this building as green as possible? Because this is what the companies want. This is what the capital funds that are investing in the buildings want. So it's a kind of a win-win, but it also puts a lot of pressure on this industry that people start to think in new ways. Of course, many things that you do, you also take for granted, like Michael talked about, that he's basically also done sustainable products in the past, but never really thought about it. All the products that we do is built to be taken apart, and every single component can be recycled, but it's not a story we tell. It's just something that feels natural and that you should do. And of course, this is one thing, but moving towards materials that are, less impact on the environment, I think for sure is very important. And you also see a lot of companies now investing a huge amount of money on making a kind of, a system where it can calculate exactly what the carbon footprint of their products is. So that will be more a sales parameter, more sales point of the product, that, for example, this chair takes less CO2 than a piece of meat. And I think this is, of course, another way to compete towards something. And if some companies start doing it, others will follow for sure. And especially the big companies, if they're doing it, others have to follow. So I think it's very interesting to see how things will look over the next 10 years. And for sure, a lot of new materials will come to exist.
All right. I would like to just reflect on a comment, if I can paraphrase him. I hope he'll forgive me. Chewing Low, who did the opening session for us for this BODW, actually also referred to the question of trends. And you mentioned in your presentation that you tend not to try to follow trends. I think, Michael, you're much the same. You don't follow trends, you kind of lead them, create them. They take you...
Didn't have a plan.
This is actually a very interesting issue. Chewing's fundamental idea was that the objective of the designer is not simply an aesthetic desire. And if it is something which is purely aesthetic and purely trend-driven, then the question of time becomes really critical, because products that have a short lifespan are products that are going to become extremely undesirable in this emerging world that we're in. And that therefore trying to follow a trend is actually a very short-term objective. And it seems to me that in both of your work, I've seen Michael's work for many, many years, and it still remains relevant now. It is as if it was designed yesterday. And likewise, from your comments, it seems that you're heading in the right direction, in the same direction rather, as well. Which I guess we could say is again, fundamentally contributing to the reduction of waste in this circular economy that we all need to to be following.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, I think the first time I really heard about sustainability is when I started working with Greg from Amico, and he was 100% on sustainability, and I think he was sort of kind of ahead of the curve, really. And then, 15 years ago, when Stark started to design for Amico, there was a bus going around with sustainability is what you need. You inherit design because it'll last forever. And, there are lots of different ways to interpret that message. And I think when I started working with Steelcase, we started designing carbon fiber furniture, which was controversial. It's Formula One, it's high tech, but the point being, it was controversial in the sense that people are saying this is using certain types of materials, but the fact is that I designed a chair that was 2 kilos. So when you transport that furniture, you offset your carbon footprint, but you also upset somebody else about the material. So, to find that balance is really complex. And, the universe for me of sustainability it's complex. And to make people content and happy on a universal stage is a very, it's hard. But I will do my best on every single stage to, do my best in every little area.
I think at this juncture, we have approximately 2 minutes left. Does anybody in the audience have any questions that they would like to raise? If you do, please put your hand up and somebody will come to you with a microphone. No, we have no questions from the audience. Gentlemen, you've done a very, very comprehensive job of presenting. Thank you very much indeed for that. It remains then for me to do a little wrap up, and thank you both very much indeed for your comments and your insights today. I think we are hopefully through the design community, if we follow your lead, we are doing our bit in advance of having to comply with a regulatory framework. And it seems to me that with the recent COP conference, we're very good worldwide in talking the talk, recognizing the global problem. But at the end of the day, it comes down to people like you at the individual level to find ways to deliver in order to resolve some of these major global problems. There's a very big gap for us to close in there, but I think with the combined expertise of the design community around the world, we have a good chance of being able to do it. Thank you both very much indeed for your time and for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Brilliant.
Thank you so much for our speakers for their valuable perspective, and it's truly great to learn how would class designers operate, and I'm sure that there are valuable takeaways for everyone. And coming up next will be our final session of this afternoon, so stay tuned.